Why pisnaxia ku isquistina Gilio-Whitaker, ismakalak and I'm coming to you today from my home in Southern California in Orange County, which is the traditional and unceded territory of the Ahashiman people in San Clemente. So I'm happy to be here with you today and doing this session, this recorded session with you, which will be followed up by a question and answer session with Natalie Diaz, which I'm really looking forward to. And I want to talk to you today about a topic that I've been talking about a lot lately since our quarantine that came down upon us in March in response to the COVID-19 crisis. So I'm going to go ahead and share. I've been talking about this a lot, as I said. I'm doing a lot of talks, Zoom session talks, and I'm going to give you a version of that talk today. So let me go ahead and just change the channel here. Let me go ahead and move this down here, and I think I'll shrink this window a little bit. There we go. So just a little bit of background about me and how I come to this topic or this work. And you may already know about me that I have written a couple of books. One of the books that I have out right now is this particular one right here called As Long as Grass Grows, the Indigenous Fight for Environmental Justice from Colonization to Standing Rock. And this is a monograph about environmental justice from an Indigenous American Indian perspective that was published in 2019. So it's been out just a little over a year ago now. The story behind this work is that it began as a graduate project, a graduate research project, master's thesis, in fact, which studied the role of collaborative organizing in order to protect a Native American sacred site here in the town where I live in San Clemente, which is a coastal town, a beach town. And this project was the culmination of a result of many years of activism around Native American issues and also environmental justice issues or environmental issues, and the writing that I had been doing as a journalist and as a researcher. And so it was sort of a natural progression of how things built up. In this book, what I do is I question the basic assumptions about how we understand environmental justice, and I argue that environmental justice needs to be indigenized in order to be responsive to indigenous concerns. And so these basic assumptions are that environmental justice is, as theory, activism, policy, and law, begins with this concept of environmental racism, which comes out of communities of color in the South, going back to the early 1980s, who were fighting against the siting of toxic waste dumps and things like that, that had plagued their communities for many years. And so what this does is it posits these assumptions about environmental racism, posits that the redistribution of environmental risk and harm. So meaning that communities of color, what this process of environmental racism does is that it exposes communities of color disproportionately to these risks. And so environmental justice says that those risks and harms need to be redistributed in equitable ways. The problem with the theory and praxis of environmental justice is that it doesn't account for, by understanding all people of color as minority communities, it doesn't differentiate between American Indians as people who have been subject to genocide, to land theft, colonial histories over 500 years, and then ecocide. Ecocide is the combination of the words genocide and ecology. So it's really that talks about the killing of ecosystems. And this, as I show in the book, was a technique that was hand in hand with genocide, the destroying of environments in order to destroy indigenous communities and peoples was a well documented technique that I look at in the book. An example of that is the uranium, this toxic legacy of uranium mining in the Southwest and also in the Pacific Northwest, where decades of uranium mining have led to massive contamination, toxic contamination of indigenous homelands, which continue to poison the people with disproportionate impacts of cancers and other kinds of respiratory illnesses because of these airborne radiation, radioactive particles. So another thing that environmental justice theory and praxis doesn't take into account is that that indigenous peoples have very different relationships to the land, very different knowledge systems that have constructed the way that they live on the land, for the last at least 15,000 years. And a way to think about this is understanding capitalism, for example, capitalism and private property, which is a core value of a settler society, of dominant society, compared to indigenous relationships to land, which is based on this relationality, we say, this understanding of the world in terms of relationships, and also responsibility to what we say is other than human relatives. So in a worldview constructed by relationships, other life forms are viewed as relations, not just inanimate objects. They are invested with agency even and life and relationality. And these knowledge systems. There's many of them, as many indigenous knowledge systems as there are indigenous peoples, because these are not universal truths. And one of the ways that we refer to indigenous knowledge around the environment, and it's always rooted in environment and land, is traditional ecological knowledge. The photo that you see here on the left is the cover of a book that came out in the last couple of years. It's one of the most important books on the topic. I teach from it in courses that I teach on environmental issues and traditional ecological knowledge. And so one of the foundations of these teachings, the way that we teach it in classrooms, is that traditional knowledge, or indigenous knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge, is basically intertwined and part of philosophical systems. Systems of knowledge are always based and intertwined with larger philosophical, we would say epistemological systems, ways of knowing the world. So philosophy and knowledge are inextricably bound together. So one of the other books that I wrote with Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz was this book here, All the Real Indians Died Off, and 20 Other Myths About Native Americans. And we talk about in that book about the master narratives that dominant society has about Native people, and really the core assumption in these master narratives, from going back 500 years to the very beginning of that first contact with Europeans, is that American Indians were inferior to Europeans. We call this social Darwinism or scientific racism. It was coded over hundreds of years into the American social landscape, eventually became coded into American law. We understand this inferiorization of Native people in the legal system through the doctrine of discovery, the trust doctrine, and the plenary power doctrine as examples that were justifications and legitimizing of these this inferiorization in order to subjugate indigenous people to the American system without their consent, despite the treaty relationships over hundreds of years. And so the result of these narratives, these master narratives, are dozens and dozens of myths that we are still living with, that construct people's knowledge about American Indians in very misinformed, misconstrued, misconceived ways, that altogether create a system that Native people are either invisibilized or they can't be seen for who they are in accurate ways, because settler society, sees itself as superior. Okay. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit. I'm laying a foundation for you for where this is going. In these last couple of months that we've been in this quarantine lockdown situation due to the coronavirus, I've become aware of a field of study that I had never encountered before, and it's called planetary health. It's actually an emerging academic discipline. And the history of it only goes back to 2014, 2015. It began with this gathering called what's called the Rockefeller Lancet Commission. The Rockefeller Foundation founded this conference in partnership with the Lancet, that is the medical journal in the UK, and they produced a white paper at the end of this conference. And it's interdisciplinary in that it brings together experts in a wide variety of disciplines that are including the hard sciences like medicine and virology and epidemiology and zoonotics, but also other kinds of disciplines and sciences as well, including environmental health, environmental studies, other ecological studies, and so what they look at is these are people that study pandemics. They study human health, and human health in the context of the environment, and how human health is impacted by, informed by our physical environments. And in the context of this, they look to study how pandemics factor in, because, in the last several decades, we see a growing increase in these dramatically more viral kinds of viruses and things, like Ebola, like SARS virus, the SARS-1 virus, the MERS virus, these causing diseases that are becoming more and more deadly to the human race. What they say is that we are at a tipping point, that over the last century or so, human health has improved with modernity, with modern medicine, such that humans are actually able to live longer lives now. We have longer life expectancies, but that we are actually, the data show that we are at a tipping point where life expectancy for the first time is now declining, and that's for a lot of different reasons. But this is what they look at, and one of the causes for that, there are many causes for that, and so, but they're still doing the research to connect all the dots, like what does the environment have to do with it. If we understand the way that humans live on the environment in a capitalist system, based on extreme extraction of resources from the environment and the loss of biodiversity, this creates a framework or the conditions that lead to the exposure to these new pathogens, that lead to these new pandemics. This is what they're studying. In this paper that they delivered, they come to the conclusion that that the reason that we are at this point is due to the failures of imagination, failure of knowledge, and the failure of governance. And they say specifically that it's about the over-reliance on economics as a measure of human progress. So this all caught my attention as somebody who teaches traditional ecological knowledge and understands biodiversity and its relationship to cultural diversity. Some of the things that I also want to take into consideration in understanding the importance of indigenous knowledge in the context of this conversation about planetary health and human health is that I believe that we are looking at, based on the research that I've been doing and have been exposed to, that we are in a state of decline of US empire. Some of the evidence for that comes out of the discipline called peace studies and conflict resolution. Johann Galtung is considered the father of this discipline, peace studies and conflict resolution. He, for many years, has been predicting the fall of the U.S. empire. You know, he had the book by that name. He's one of these kinds of guys that has written many, many, many books. And this book called The Fall of the U.S. Empire and Then What was written in 2009. So that's some important work to check out. There was a Pentagon study that came out just about 3 years ago that was released by it was actually done at the U.S. Army College. That was called At Our Own Peril, the Department of Defense Risk Assessment in a Post-Primacy World. In this study, they acknowledged that the U.S. is losing primacy on the international arena. And interestingly, one of the things that they talk about in this study that will be the result of this loss of primacy is greater civil unrest. So we can, you know, if we look at it, what's happening now in terms of the Black Lives Matter protests that we have been seeing, this eruption of civil unrest, and these uprisings that are so stunning in the last couple of weeks, we can easily connect that to the study, to this thing that the study predicted. Also, Joseph Tainter is a scholar who does work on the collapse of complex societies, and I would recommend you looking into his work as well, looking at the current historical moment in terms of collapse, and paralleling that to the Roman Empire. And he's certainly not the only person to do that. And then climate change. Climate change is another thing to keep in mind with, you know, in terms of context and where we find ourselves in the current moment. Climate change, there is a strand in the research that questions whether or not it's anthropocentric or human caused. I think that's something to pay attention to. But from my perspective, I think that the bigger problem is that we are dealing with massive environmental destruction. Whether or not we attribute climate change to human causes, there are massive other problems environmentally that we're dealing with that are aside from climate change, and that it bears mentioning. So the bottom line with all of this, where I'm going, is that that epidemiologists have been predicting a global pandemic for many years, but the SARS-2 coronavirus that results in COVID-19 is not the big one. They have been predicting a pandemic more along the lines of an influenza. Because of the research, the knowledge that we know in American Indian studies, we know that ecocide, the killing of ecosystems, is parallel to genocide and to culturecide. So, and on the other side of that is that we also know that 80% of the world's biodiversity is controlled by indigenous people. So understanding the connections between indigenous knowledge and the preservation of the world's remaining biodiverse regions. Indigenous knowledge contains critical keys to planetary sustainability. That's what this is what I'm getting at here. Going back to that Lancet study, talking about addressing the failure of knowledge. So anthropocentric epistemological frameworks, just meaning human knowledge frameworks as we understand them, has brought us to this place in late capitalist society, characterized by massive, extractive industry, and dominant, careless domination of the environment, has brought us to this point of a sixth mass extinction event. And we have to be able to understand that, and understand that planetary health and human health's connection to that is not just a problem of economics and science. It's a problem of philosophy and knowledge. And this is the argument that I keep making. Indigenous, science and political leaders need to be listening to indigenous peoples, because indigenous societies are the very definition of sustainability. When you live in any given ecosystem for tens of thousands of years, that is sustainability, and that's what the world has to learn from indigenous societies. That's where I'm getting at, and that is about understanding the indigenous relationship to the natural world, and what the rest of the world has to learn about that. In a recent episode of Democracy Now! in April, Amy Goodman had on this guest named Dr. Peter Daszak, and this is a quote from him. He says, he's not talking about indigenous knowledge at all. This guy is a zoonotics person. He's a zoologist. He said exactly, we need to reevaluate our relationship with the environment. And so this, bringing it around, we do need to reevaluate that relationship and incorporate different kinds of knowledges. We need to be living on the planet in different ways that are sustainable. So to wrap it up, here's some resources for you. The Planetary Health Alliance is housed in Harvard University with over 200 partnering and growing institutions globally. There's a massive database of research on there if you're interested in learning more about this. I also encourage you to read the Rockefeller Lancet Commission report to understand this new field of planetary health. And then I wrote an article for High Country News that was published a couple of months back, and you can look that up and kind of see what I just presented to you in written form. So that's it. I'm looking forward to having this conversation with Natalie here in the next couple of minutes. And thank you for listening, and be well, everybody.